Welcome to Moments with Marianne. I'm so delighted we're spending this time here today. We have a very inspiring show coming right up with two very special guests. Our first guest today is Zoe Weil, and she's here today to share with us her new award-winning book, Most Good, Least Harm, a simple principle for a better world and meaningful life. Now, Zoe is a co-founder and president of the Institute for Humane Education. A humane educator since 1985, Zoe has been giving people the tools to make humane and sustainable choices. She created the first Humane Education Certificate Program and Masters of Education in Humane Education in the United States. She received her master's degree from Harvard Divinity School and the University of Pennsylvania. So let's welcome to the show, Zoe Weil.
Thank you so much, Marianne. It's great to be here.
You know, what an honor it is to have you here and to talk about your new book. My goodness, I'm so excited about this. And I heard your TED Talk, and gosh, you got some really good information I think people need to hear.
Thank you.
Well, why don't you share with us what inspired you to write this book?
So I've been a humane educator for over 30 years now, and humane educators teach about the interconnected issues of human rights and animal protection and environmental preservation with the goal of preparing students of all ages to be what we call solutionaries for a better world. And for many years, when I first started this work, I would carry a bag with me when I would do a school presentation, like an assembly program. And in the bag, I would have different products that represented choices. So I might have a cloth rag and paper towel, or I might have a disposable diaper and a cloth diaper, or I might have a reusable mug and a styrofoam cup. And I would take these items out of the bag and I would say, which of these two items does the most good and the least harm to people, to animals, and to the environment? And after many years of asking that question, I realized that doing the most good and the least harm had become the guiding principle of my life. And I also realized that this was a principle that almost everybody could get behind. And in fact, when I ask people, and I've asked thousands of people in my programs and speaking opportunities to tell me if they think this is a good principle by which to live. And everybody agrees that doing the most good and the least harm to ourselves and others is a good principle by which to live. It's really putting the golden rule into practice in a globalized world in which our everyday choices have impacts far beyond what we can see. So if we all think that this is a good principle by which to live, then in such a complex world, how do we go about putting it into practice? And so that's why I wrote the book, to give people the opportunity to put this principle into practice.
Well, I'm so glad that you wrote this book. I mean, I learned a lot from it. As people are looking to make changes, there's a lot of things to consider, and it all starts with education.
That's right. And it's, it seems like such a simple principle, but it's really challenging in today's world. To give you some examples, there's nobody who I have ever met who wants to participate in or support slavery. And yet, buying something as simple as a chocolate bar could be supporting the enslavement of children in Africa who are getting those cocoa beans. And so without knowing the impacts of our choices, it becomes very difficult. Once we know, then we can make a different choice and we can support a chocolate company that does not use the labor of enslaved people. Sometimes, though, it's really tricky because many of the choices that we make don't really feel like choices. They feel like necessities. So, for example, I have a computer, I have a cell phone, I have a car. I need all of these products, essentially, in order to do my work in the world. And yet, all of them have components in them that are destructive to the environment, and I may not be able to find, a truly humane and sustainable cell phone or computer. And so when people realize that some of their everyday choices are ones that they can't make a more positive choice about because those positive choices don't yet exist, sometimes people just throw up their hands and say, well, why bother? But in fact, then we can take the next step, which is participating in change, working for change, and being what we call solutionaries who help companies and governments to make new policies and make new products that are restorative and just for everybody.
Yeah, what a big difference that makes. And it's interesting when we look at just how we can do the most good with the least harm. How do we put these principles into practice? What are some things that we need to keep in mind as we're going throughout our day?
So there are a few things to keep in mind. And in my book, I described keys to living according to this principle. And I call it the MOGO principle, MOGO being short for most good. And by the way, there's a reason that it's most good and least harm as opposed to all good and no harm. There's no way we can live in the world without causing some harm. So there are a few different principles. And the first one is to try to live your epitaph. And what do I mean by that? You know, most of us don't write our epitaph. Somebody else writes our obituary or delivers the eulogy at our funeral or writes our epitaph. We don't get to do that. But what if we did? You know, what if listeners right now or after this program is over were to sit down and write down on a piece of paper what they would want their epitaph to be and then pasted it on the wall so that they could see it and then live accordingly. And if you really think about what you would want said about you when you die, that's an opportunity to live accordingly while you're alive. So that's sort of an overarching way to think about doing the most good and the least harm. But then there are much more nitty-gritty steps, which are really examining your choices. And we can do this by picking any product that you use. It could be a food you eat. It could be an item of clothing that you wear. It could be something in your pantry. And just examine its life cycle. And that might seem like it could be overwhelming, but in fact, it's really fascinating to find out details about the things that we use every single day. You know, if I take a t-shirt, for example, and I look at the tag on it, I'm not going to get very much information. I'm going to find out what kind of fabric it's made of. I'm going to find out where it was produced and how to launder it. That's about it. And so to really discover more information about it, I'm going to have to do some research. But of course, the internet world makes that relatively easy to do. And, you know, if the t-shirt is made out of cotton, was it grown organically or was it not grown organically? Where might that cotton have been grown? And who is involved in its growth and production? Because just because it might say made in China doesn't mean that the cotton was grown in China. The cotton could have been grown many other places. So these kinds of details, while listeners might be thinking, why should I care? And that would just be so time consuming. The process of learning and bringing our curiosity to our daily lives is inherently interesting. And then when we gain information, we have the freedom to make different choices and choices that are more aligned with our values. And truly, it feels good to make choices that are deeply aligned with our values. Living out of alignment with our values is basically lacking integrity, and that just doesn't feel good as a human being, not to live with integrity. And so it may seem like a big job, but going on the beginnings of that journey can open up pathways and doorways to living a life that is truly meaningful and feels really positive.
I know you talk about, coming to a place where, our desires eclipse our values. And I'd love for you to share, I know we've been talking on that, but I'd love for you to share what that means to our listeners.
Sure. Okay. So let's say you discover that a favorite food you like to eat causes tremendous suffering to animals, to the environment, to potentially people who are working in slaughterhouses or working in other aspects of the food industry, and you really love that food, then you're faced with this quandary of, okay, so now what do? I love this food, but I don't really want to participate in animal cruelty and environmental destruction. And that's where we can be faced with our desires potentially eclipsing our values. Now, I can tell you, as somebody who has made a lot of dietary choices to reflect my values, it has gotten so easy to do so in today's world because there's so many options for foods that taste similar to things we love, but that don't come with the cruelty and suffering. And so often we don't have to choose our values over our desires because often we're able to have both the tastes we love and the values that we want to live by.
Now, I know in your book you talk about self-reflection on our values. Why is that important to do?
Well, we can think we know what our values are, and yet if we're not living according to them in this globalized world, then how deeply resonant are our values with our lives? So, for example, to get back to that same example of food, most people value compassion. In fact, I've asked thousands of people what they think are the best qualities of human beings, which is another way of sort of defining our values. And compassion has risen to the top almost all the time when I ask this question. So if compassion is a great value to us, then what does it mean to live with compassion when our choices may be affecting others far removed from us, but connected to us through the global economy? So we might know what compassion looks like for a friend or a family member or a neighbor. But what does compassion look like when somebody might be toiling in a field for pennies a day and living in poverty, or an animal might be confined in a cage for the duration of her life to produce the eggs that we may want to eat? And once we see that, once we reflect on our values and say, compassion, that's a serious value of mine, then by reflecting on it and reflecting on our intertwined lives in this complex world we live in, we have the opportunity to put that value into practice more deeply.
I love that. I'm so glad that you took time to explain that. And I love how your book talks about developing community and finding community. Why is that important?
Well, we can live more and more isolated lives these days all the time. We don't even need to go to the movies anymore because we can just watch them from the comfort of our living rooms. And when we decide to go on this journey of doing the most good and the least harm, we are going to inevitably expose ourselves to some really painful realities in the world, to some atrocities and horrors and destructions that really may be burdensome and difficult to endure. And we need community of fellow solutionaries and people who want to go on this path so that we don't feel isolated and alone, and we don't sort of potentially fall into despair. And Joan Baez had this great line where she said, action is the antidote to despair. And building community is the first step toward communal collaborative action that is so enlivening and so enriching. And, I can imagine people listening to this podcast right now thinking to themselves, I'm not sure I want to go on this journey. It just sounds like a lot of work. It sounds like I could get depressed. But the reality is that the other side of this, where you've built community of fellow solutionaries and people who really want to strive to live according to this principle, is so enriching and so deeply meaningful. And I have had many people tell me that when they've gone on this MOGO path, or they've started a group to read this book together and act accordingly, they have found new friends and new aspirations and new opportunities that were just so deeply meaningful.
I love that. My goodness. Well, and as we start making that journey looking outwards, for the products that we're looking to really incorporate in our lives and that make the least harm impact, how do we determine which ones we should use and which ones we should stay away from?
So again, this is just so much easier these days because of the internet. So, you can really it's as simple as just doing a search. Doing a search on, regular cotton versus organic cotton, or doing a search on the foods you eat. And there are so many opportunities to find different options, including products that aren't tested on animals versus products that are. I mean, there are companies that will tell you, we don't test our products on animals. And somebody might be thinking, well, I don't even know what that means. So just to let people know what that means, many personal care items, or, whether it's soap or it's body lotion or it's cosmetics, are literally dripped into the eyes of conscious rabbits, force-fed to animals in quantities that are meant to kill them, and smeared onto their abraded skin. And, we don't need to do that for a new lipstick or for a new shampoo. And many companies don't do it. So if you have the choice between supporting a company that does that and supporting a company that doesn't do that, could be a fairly simple choice for people once they have the information. And it's just easy to get that information. And I also invite people to visit our website, humaneeducation.org, where we have loads of free downloadable resources, primarily for educators, but also for people who want to learn how to put these principles into practice more deeply. And we also just produced a solutionary guidebook, and it's free and downloadable, and you can find it on our website and download it. And it's written for teachers, but it offers a 14-step process for becoming a solutionary, and anybody can download this guidebook and go through that process and practice it. And there's tons of resources in there as well.
Oh, what a great resource that would be for people. I know you talk about how our work towards a healthier planet in turn helps us find inner peace. How does that all come together?
So this gets back to the integrity piece again. I start off the book talking about my own quest for inner peace when I was in my 20s. And I remember a rabbi saying to me when I was really struggling with the concept of faith. And he said, Zoe, it doesn't matter what you believe. It matters what you do. Now, I realize that that's a different theological perspective than some other religions. But in Judaism, what you do matters more than what you believe. And so he shared that with me. And I was, at the time, I think I was 19 years old or 20 years old. And that concept, it matters what you do, not what you believe, has really led me on this path to thinking about and developing this MOGO principle. Because when you live according to your values, when you really strive to do the most good and the least harm, you find inner peace. That inner peace isn't just something that you feel, it's something that you actually do. You create a more peaceful world. You create a more peaceful life. And you can do that through your choices.
So you talked earlier when we started this discussion about humane education. So what is that, and why is it important that we make sure that this is part of a curriculum?
Thank you for asking about that. So humane education is education designed to prepare people to be solutionaries who can address and solve the problems that we face, whether local problems or national problems or global problems, in ways that do the most good and the least harm for all people and animals and the environment. That's what humane education does. And, really, if we want to create a more peaceful, just, and healthy world for all life, then we need to prepare young people so that they are able to take on that mantle. I mean, young people are both inheriting and will shape the future. And right now, the actual mission of the United States Department of Education is to prepare students for global competitiveness. And personally, I don't think that that's a worthy enough mission given the challenges that we face in the world. Climate change is an existential crisis that threatens life on this planet in so many levels. We are in the midst of the sixth great extinction right now. And we have a growing population of people who all would like to have the same opportunities and same lifestyle as many of us in the West enjoy, and why shouldn't they? But will the world be able to accommodate rising lifestyles if we don't find sustainable means of production and restorative energy systems and all of the rest, so that we're not polluting our planet into oblivion? And given that, how important it becomes to educate children to be more than global competitors, to educate them to be collaborators in the worthiest mission of all, which is to ensure that all life can thrive for generation after generation. So if one believes that that should be the driving force of education, then we need humane education, because humane education delivers this process for young people to work collaboratively, to identify issues locally or globally that they're passionate about, and to understand the systems that perpetuate the problems that we face, to see the root causes, to understand all the stakeholders, who's harmed, who benefits, how can we actually solve these problems at their core, not put Band-Aids on them, not just donate food to the food pantry, but actually work to eliminate poverty. I mean, these are deeply meaningful issues for young people, in which, if we do this right, they get to use all of their academic skills. They get to put numeracy and literacy and communication and the scientific method, along with critical thinking and systems thinking, into practice and work together to create a better world. And so when teachers do this, when teachers bring this to students, and I'm excited to say that many teachers are, in fact, San Mateo, California, the whole entire county of San Mateo, which is between San Francisco and Palo Alto, that county has made this solutionary approach the foundation of their philosophy and framework for the entire county, serving over 100,000 students in 23 school districts. So it's really exciting. And if we do this, and young people get to do this, then they're enriched, the world gets better, schools become more thriving places, teachers are happier. It's just a win for everybody.
Yeah, without a doubt. Well, and the next generation is asking for this. You see where, the millennials are leaving jobs kind of in droves, that they feel that are unfulfilling or don't really have purpose, to find jobs that are, really kind of feeding their soul.
Yes, they are. And, we look at, the remarkable Greta Thunberg, who, I mean, she is one child among millions now who are speaking out for their future. And, the fact that she was just named Times Person of the Year reflects this growing urgency among youth. And, how can we not respond to that by making education actually relevant and meaningful for their future?
Yeah, without a doubt. My goodness, she's such an inspiration. And so it kind of has me thinking, I mean, I know in your book you talk about the 3 I's. What are those? Because I'm sure our listeners want to hear that.
So the 3 I's refer to inquiry, introspection, and integrity. And I've already talked a little bit about integrity, and I've even talked about inquiry indirectly. So what I mean by that is, if we sort of think of these 3 I's as a pathway for us, inquiry is where we are willing to inquire about the impacts of our choices, and whether those choices are product choices, whether they're work choices, whether they're political choices, we are really willing to inquire deeply about the impacts of our choices, and then to introspect about them. So when we inquire and we discover, I am making choices that are causing harm, I'm making choices that could be different if I were willing to perhaps not allow my desires to eclipse my values, that's the introspection process. And doing those two things together, inquiry and introspection, leads us to the ability to live with more integrity. And so it's a simple process, and it's a simple way of thinking about how we go about setting ourselves on this path.
I know you have quite a few stories in your book. What is one that really stands out for you that you'd like to share with our listeners?
It's hard to just pick one. I'd like to talk about one humane educator named Kim Corona. And this is a woman who, in her 20s, she entered our graduate program. So we have an online graduate program that's offered through Antioch University in New England, and anybody can enroll in it from around the world. And Kim was one of those people, and when I met her, she was perhaps the kindest person I had ever met. I mean, her heart was just so open and full, and all she wanted to do was good in the world. And the more that she would find out about issues in the world, human rights issues and animal protection issues and environmental issues, the more deeply she would strive to live accordingly. And she became a humane educator. She works for an organization called HEART. She develops humane education programs and materials and resources that anybody in the world can use. And it's so beautiful to see what somebody who goes on this path can do with their life and how meaningful their life can become and how many people they can reach. And she's one of those examples, and she's a real hero to me. She's a role model for me for kindness.
Oh my God, she sounds like such an amazing person. And I'm sure you've met so many just great people along your journey who are looking to make such a positive impact. And we just applaud you for the work that you're doing. Where can our listeners connect with you and learn more about your work and your book and be part of your community?
Thank you so much for asking that. So people can go to our website, humaneeducation.org, and there are two E's in the middle of that, Humane Education. And we have a brand new Center for Solutionary Change that we're building out to become a hub of learning and professional development. And we're going to be featuring different opportunities for people to take online courses. And we have loads of free downloadable resources, including book recommendations. And so people can find everything that we offer at our website, and I hope and that's where they can find the Solutionary Guidebook as well. And so they can sign up, download whatever they want, and people will be able to read our blog and get our newsletter and just stay connected. Of course, people can unsubscribe at any time as well if they do sign up. And the other place where I blog regularly is at Psychology Today. I have a blog there called Becoming a Solutionary. So if people are interested, they can read it there. It also then comes out on our blog at the Institute for Humane Education. So I hope people will visit us and they will embrace the MOGO principle and think about how they can become solutionaries.
Well, Zoe, thank you so much for taking the time to be on the show with us here today.
Oh, it's just been delightful, Marianne. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Well, thank you, Zoe. It's been such an honor to spend this time with you and, of course, to talk about your new book, Most Good, Least Harm. Most Good, Least Harm is available at Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and all indie retailers. Well, on that note, we're going to pause here for a quick break. You've been listening to Moments with Marianne. We'll be right back after these messages.
Internationally recognized and award-winning author Judy Goodman works and teaches outside the box of limited thinking. Working with people from every walk of life, her goal is to empower you to be the best you can be, no matter what the challenge is. Born with the gift of seeing beyond our normal vision, she has an extraordinary gift of working with every challenge. teaching beyond conventional wisdom. Her work is described as life-changing. Visit judygoodman.com. That's judygoodman.com.
There comes a moment when you realize you're somewhere special, when you discover that each beautiful creature that you see has been rescued from a life of absolute horror and brought to this incredibly free place. Here's where their lives were forever changed and where yours will as well. Discover over 500 tigers, bears, and lions at the brand new visitor center at the Wild Animal Sanctuary just outside Denver. For more information, visit wildanimalsanctuary.org. Discover true freedom at the Wild Animal Sanctuary.
There are nearly 2 million Americans living with amputation. Many live right here in San Antonio. Becoming an amputee can be scary, frustrating, isolating, but there's no reason to feel alone. The San Antonio Amputee Foundation is here to help support you and guide you toward resources such as home and car modifications and even prosthetic limbs. For more information or to make a donation, visit saamputee.org. We'll help you live a full, active life, one step at a time. San Antonio Amputee Foundation, healing limbs, hearts, and souls.
If not me, then who? This ethos is driving the Travis Manion Foundation to empower veterans and families of fallen heroes to develop character in future generations. In 2007, Marine First Lieutenant Travis Manion was killed in Iraq while saving his wounded teammates. Travis's legacy lives on in the 5 words he spoke before leaving for his final deployment. If not me, then who? Guided by this mantra, veterans continue their service, developing strong relationships in the community, and thrive in their post-military lives. Visit TravisManion.org and ensure the character of our nation's heroes lives on in the next generation. If not me, then who?
Welcome back to Moments with Marianne. We're here today with special guest ed-slattery, who's sharing with us his life story that was the basis for the book by Emmy Award-winning journalist Brian Kubler, titled The Long Blink, a true story of trauma, forgiveness, and one man's fight for safer roads. Now, the Slatterys went through a horrific tragedy. Since then, Ed has become an advocate for the Truck Safety Coalition. So let's welcome to the show, ed-slattery.
Well, thank you for having me.
You know, Ed, what an honor it is to have you here to talk about this. My goodness, you know, I think there needs to be more awareness on this topic, and I'm so glad that we're spending this time here talking about your story. I mean, The Long Blink, it was a really kind of hard read, but I think a lot of times people really need to know what's going on when we talk about road safety.
Absolutely, and we all need to take responsibility for our own actions on the road, and it can't be emotional. People need to put their emotions in check when they're driving, because it's not personal.
Yeah, I mean, everyone's trying to get to where they're going. Well, and so I know that you had an Emmy award-winning journalist that actually wrote the book, The Long Blink.
Right.
You know, why don't you share with us your story for our listeners that are new to your story?
On August 16th, 2010, I was at work in Washington, D.C., working for the USDA, Department of Agriculture, as an economic analyst. I received a phone call at about noon. My wife and my 2 boys were coming home that day from the family vacation or family picnic, which I did not go to that year because I had taken 2 weeks of vacation for Boy Scout trips with my boys. And so I wasn't there. I received a call at noon that my boys were at Akron Children's Hospital and that I should get there as soon as possible. They didn't know about my wife, so I had to call around to various adult hospitals, and none of them had her. At that point, I didn't know what to do, and my cell phone rang, and it was the Portage County coroner. At which point I just said, so I guess she's dead, which is, in retrospect, a really bizarre thing to say, but it pretty much answered the question I had. And so we talked for a few minutes, and I okayed him doing an autopsy, though it didn't seem like really necessary because we knew at that point, it's actually when I finally found out what happened. They were hit by a truck in a construction zone, although I didn't know any details. I didn't know how it happened. I just know that it happened, and it didn't seem sensible to me to do an autopsy. We knew she got hit by an 80,000-pound truck, but he suggested we needed to do it for legal reasons, and so I know Susan didn't care. We had discussed death, I think, as any married couple does, and she didn't want to waste a grave site on her. She wanted to be cremated, and she was pretty clear that once she was gone, it wouldn't matter to her what happened. So I agreed to the autopsy. My colleagues were simultaneously getting me some airfare. I just gave my credit card to one of my colleagues, and she booked me a flight to Akron. Another very close colleague took me to the airport in D.C., and I flew to Akron and found my two sons seriously injured, one clinging to life. We didn't really know if he was going to live or not. And so that's what I found on August 16th, 2010.
Yeah, I'm so sorry for your loss. And I was astounded when I read your book, just how many people are killed on a yearly basis from large trucks on the highways. I mean, it's insane.
Well, since Susan was killed, let me get this right, about 40,000 more people have been killed. And I want to say very clearly, not all these crashes are the truckers' fault. I understand that. I'm just asking truckers to take responsibilities for the ones that are. Also, I want to say that all work is honorable as long as you do it honorably. And I honor the work that truckers do. So I want that to be very clear. And I have some good friends who are truckers. And we talk very honestly and openly with each other. I am not attacking them. I do think the industry has some major problems. In 2017, 700 truckers died. It is the deadliest industry in America for workers. Most of those died in single truck and truck-on-truck crashes. These are almost all preventable. Most accidents in any mode of transportation are human error. They're very rarely mechanical errors. So human beings need to take responsibility for what's going on in their vehicle. And it's not sufficient to blame it on four-wheelers. That's what commercial motor vehicle drivers call us. We are four-wheelers. And what they have to put up with from us is really nuts. We need to be kinder to each other on the road. And to our four-wheeler friends out there, which is most of us, if you get into a crash with an 80,000-pound semi, you're going to lose. So it's not something to play around with. So the fatality rate now is up to 5,000 a year. When Susan was killed, it was under 4,000. So it's getting worse.
Yeah, without a doubt. And it's heartbreaking to hear these statistics. Me personally, I had a cousin who was killed when a bus ran a red light. You're talking about big vehicles, that are hitting smaller vehicles, and there's just no way that they're designed to handle that kind of an impact.
Well, that's right, and I'm sorry for your loss.
Thank you.
None of us gets out of this life unscathed. There are awful things that happen to all of us. But I think, and I've always taught my children this, that the measure of a person is not how they screw up, it's how they react. and we need to, and I think maybe that's why I asked Brian to write the book and why I am so public about what happened to us. I think that the word needs to get out, and I think that we need to just be kinder to each other. And I hope that I can strike a blow for that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, without a doubt. Well, how did your relationship with Brian even start that this book came to be?
Well, Brian is actually a crime investigative reporter here in Baltimore, and this really was not on his beat, but his producer directed him to do this story, and it was the story on our crash and the story on our return home from Akron. And he did 3 stories on us at different phases. So first, when we returned to Baltimore, then when Matthew was released from the hospital, he went to Ohio with us when we went back a year later. And his station did another story when we built our house for Matthew. So we have a totally accessible home for Matthew. And one of the issues that we advocate for in Congress is increasing insurance limits for commercial motor vehicles, because presently the minimum is $750,000. The average is about $1 million. $1 million would not have gotten my 2 boys out of the PICU.
Oh,
So
yeah, without a
that's
doubt.
Yeah, I mean, that's just totally inadequate. Those insurance limits have not increased in over 30 years. So they have not kept up with medical inflation. They've not kept up with any inflation. And so that is one issue that we advocate for in Congress. And there is a bill in Congress and in the Senate now. I don't think there's much hope that they'll get passed. But the political process, you get it going and you start building a consensus for this. And hopefully that will happen someday.
I hope so too, because I mean, they really need to take a look at this industry and overhaul it. And one of the things that I was surprised about is, the hours that truckers can drive and, how often truckers end up falling asleep.
Well, the majority of truckers admit to driving fatigued and or actually dozing off at the wheel. And our trucker dozed off at the wheel. And your audience will have to read the book to find out why it's called The Long Blank. But I taught college for 20 years, and my students would do a micro sleep on occasion. You've probably experienced this where your head drops, and actually it's your head drop that wakes you up. At 60 miles an hour, you just went 100 yards. So you cannot drive fatigued. And driving fatigued is no different than driving drunk.
That's true, because you're so not aware, especially when you have a vehicle that may have a ton of weight, and you're looking at that compared to the other vehicles on a highway. I mean, that's scary.
It is scary. And I know that a lot of people, and I get this comment a lot, I'm scared around those trucks. Well, my advice is to not be scared. Be confident in your ability to drive. If you're scared, you should get off the road. So my advice is to drive smart and have confidence in your ability to drive. Keep your situational awareness so that you're constantly scanning your mirrors front and in front of you so that you know where you're at and you know what's around you.
Well, being aware is a real big part, and and not having that fear. You're so right, because I mean, you have to be confident in your driving abilities and just be very conscientious of what's happening around you. You just can't doze off yourself.
Well, that's right. And you cannot rely on everybody else to do the right thing. You need to make sure that you're watching them. My father taught me that when that guy, he said, "You see that guy's left turn signal?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "He's definitely turning right."
Mm-hmm.
And we know this. Don't make a move around a car until he actually makes the turn that he's signaling he's going to make. So all of those situational awareness issues, and bailout plans. What would I do if this guy does that?
Yeah.
You need to be constantly thinking like that.
Well, and when we look at just some of the different laws that are in place, I understand that you've really become an advocate for changing some of these laws to make the roads safer.
Well, I'm on the board of Parents Against Tired Trucking, and we work with other truck safety organizations to go to Congress and advocate for change. I also listen to my trucking friends because there are some things that make perfect sense to me and I don't really need their explanations. But there are other things that may be more technical that I actually need to get information from them. Now, they and I may still disagree at the end of the day, but I at least, need to hear from them. I need to hear why they would not want automatic emergency braking, which my car has. My car has lane diversion alerts. Why would they be opposed to that? Why would they be opposed to an increase in insurance limits? And there are other issues that we talk about, and adults should be able to have a conversation and disagree with each other at the end of the day and still go have dinner together.
Yeah, without a doubt. My goodness. Well, and, this must have going through such a tragedy is heartbreaking enough. And then having to go through a trial on top of that must have been just like kind of reopening the wound. How was that for you?
Well, fortunately, we didn't actually have to go through a trial because he pled guilty. But we did have to go to the court to make a victim impact statement. And Doug, the driver, blames me for him going to jail because I basically said he needed to go to jail. Not because I think he's an evil person, not because I thought he was going to ever do something like that again, but because I do believe in deterrence. And the trucking industry just gets away with this kind of stuff. And we follow truck crashes every day. So we get information on these truck crashes, and we get information on what charges have been filed and not been filed. And there's a real prejudice out there against filing charges like vehicular homicide against truckers. It's sort of boys will be boys, and this was just an accident, and that kind of attitude of just brushing these things aside as just an accident. Well, I don't call them accidents anymore. I call them crashes. It's not quite an on purpose, but it's really not quite an accident either. These things are foreseeable. Our driver had been reprimanded several times by his company for failure to maintain his lane and for trailing too closely. He was on several medications that had drowsiness as side effects. He got 3 hours of attempted sleep. We don't know that he ever slept in the 24 hours before he killed my wife and permanently disabled my son. So that's not an accident. That's a foreseeable.
Yeah, without a doubt. And there should be some consequences when actions could be taken so that drivers are not, falling asleep at the wheel, especially with such a huge vehicle, but they're not falling asleep at the wheel and taking other people's lives. There has to be some accountability.
Well, I agree. And I think that, and I want to reiterate, probably 90% of truckers out there are really safe and do a great job. They're hardworking, honest people trying to put bread on the table.
Yeah.
They're away from their families an awful lot. And I honor and respect that. But that other percentage that is not safety conscious is of concern. Now, there are institutional issues, such as the hours of service. These guys are allowed to work 14-hour days and drive 11 of those. Now, I could do that once, But could I do that day after day after day after day after day? That would be very, very difficult. The other issue is they're paid by the mile. So if they're stuck in traffic or if they're stuck at a warehouse, they're not getting paid.
Yeah.
So now I'm an economist, and in my humble opinion, that is the biggest problem in the industry, is that these guys are paid by the mile. So now that they have electronic logging devices, they can't cheat on their hours of service very easily. And so they really have to, clock out after their 14-hour day, regardless of how many miles they covered and how much money they've made. So my guess is that now the incentive is to drive faster, drive a little bit more recklessly in order to get those miles in within that 14-hour day. Now, I'm anxious to wait for the studies because we haven't had ELDs all that long. I'm anxious to wait for the studies to see what they really show us.
I think a lot of people are very curious to hear about those as well, because when you look at people with that kind of work, it just seems that it's very treacherous, especially for, the rest of the drivers on the road and other truckers, what you have as well. And I hear what you're saying, where most truckers, 90% of the truckers, are very responsible and take their job seriously and get the rest that they need. But we still have high percentages of them that seem to be getting into really, in these big car accidents that take people's lives.
Yeah, and when a semi hits another vehicle, they're not likely, especially a four-wheeler, they're not likely to die. They don't tend to die in those kinds of crashes, although it certainly does happen. We do have examples of truckers every year who drive themselves off the road and end up dying because they didn't want to kill somebody else. So they're just incredible heroes out there. But those aren't the problem, are they?
No, not at all. I mean, it's just heartbreaking. Obviously, this is a industry that needs an overhaul and needs some, they need to make some changes, because it's been done a certain way all this time. Doesn't mean that it can't improve.
Well, it can improve, but there are huge forces at play that are much, much more powerful than safety advocates. The American Trucking Association and the Owner Operators Association have outsized seats at the table. So when we have hearings in front of Congress, they are overrepresented and the safety community is underrepresented. And we don't have the money to have lobbyists just sitting in Washington, D.C. to pounce anytime a congressman offers a proposal to make the roads safer. So it's very, very difficult for grassroots people. I mean, think about Mothers Against Drunk Driving. The years and years and years it spent for that passed before they could actually start to have some effect. And they're a very powerful group of folks, but they don't always get what they want either. So it's politically a very difficult row to hoe, but we keep hoeing.
Well, I'm glad that you do, because it's something that needs to be addressed. And I want to talk to you about forgiveness, because that's one of the subtitles of the book. The true story of trauma, forgiveness, and one man's fight for safer roads. How has that journey of forgiveness been for you with the driver?
Oh my gosh. In the last 3 months, I have really kind of turned the corner on this whole idea of forgiveness. Forgiveness is a passive verb. What does that mean? What's the action that I have to take to find this forgiveness? So that's a very difficult thing to get a handle on. I think for about most of the last 9 years, I was kind of self-righteous about this whole thing. In order to get forgiveness, you have to ask for it. You have to say, I'm sorry. And that's just not ever happened with Doug. And I don't see it happening. So can I find forgiveness when the other person isn't willing to make amends? And I think what I've finally realized, and I think it probably is just common sense, and I should have realized a long time ago, forgiveness from me requires nothing from him. You either forgive or you don't. And I think I finally have. I feel like I'm receiving some sort of peace. You might call it grace by forgiving. My wish is that he can receive the grace of the forgiveness, but he has to sort that out for himself, and he doesn't actually have to come to me. He just needs to figure out what forgiveness means for himself. What does it mean to be forgiven? And so I guess that's my prayer for him, is that he finds a way to forgive himself. I don't think he's taking responsibility for what happened. And your listeners can read the book to find out the details of that whole thing, because Doug and I did meet on his porch after he got out of prison, and it was not a real pretty sight. There was no physical fisticuffs or anything, but he at least to this date has never said, "I'm sorry for what I did. I take responsibility for what I did." And the most he'll ever say is, "I'm sorry for having been involved in such an event." That's not really taking responsibility. Because he also said, I did nothing wrong that day, and that's clearly not true. But that's for him. And so forgiveness from me is mine to give, and it can't be contingent on anything he does. It also releases me of anger.
Yeah.
It will never release me of the hurt. And I see my son struggle every day in a wheelchair with aphasia, so that he can't talk to me in complete sentences, and oftentimes can't even find the word that he wants to say. So he starts talking to me, and then very often says, "Never mind," because he can't find the word. That part of the pain the only way I get out of that is the end of my life. And so I live with that. I don't live with the anger at him anymore. I just live with a son who can't do the things he should be doing.
Yeah. Well, it's got to be so difficult to come to a place of forgiveness, especially when you have someone who is so adamant, in regards to what the actual facts are. You look at that and you're like, gosh, we've got these facts, and you caused this accident that took somebody's life and disabled, another person. There should be some, personal responsibility. And that sounds like that's just his own journey.
That is his journey. And so I have to respect his journey and let him pursue it. If he ever came to me and wanted to tell me, "Ed, I'm really sorry," I would give him a big hug, and I would say, "I know. Yeah. I know you are. And let's move on with our lives and live the best lives that we can, given what has happened." And none of us get out of this life without having to deal with some tragedies. So we all just have to figure out how to deal with that.
Yeah, move forward with that. What final thoughts do you want to leave our listeners with, Ed?
Well, first of all, go get the book. Amazon, Barnes and Noble. I personally prefer you go to your local bookstore. But that's one thing, but really be safe. And so when I sign books, what I sign is be safe. My oldest son was a fighter pilot, and they talk about situational awareness. And that is being aware of your situation at all times and be vigilant. And I would also, stealing from Ellen DeGeneres, be kind to each other. And on the road, you can do that by being safe.
Yeah, without a doubt. Well, Ed, thank you so much for taking the time to be on the show with us here today. Well, thanks for having me. And, I hope your listeners take
heed.
Well, thank you, Ed. I really appreciate you taking the time to share your difficult story with us. It's one that really needs to be heard. Again, if you'd like to connect with Ed and learn more about truck safety, you can at trucksafety.org for more information. The long blink's available at Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and all indie retailers. Well, we're at the end of our time today. I would like to thank everyone for tuning in. You're listening to Moments with Marianne. And remember, make every moment count.
In a single moment, your life can change. Moments with Marianne is a transformative hour that covers an endless array of topics with the best of the best. Her guests are leaders in their fields, ranging from inspirational authors, top industry leaders, business and spiritual entrepreneurs. Each guest is gifted and a true visionary, a recognized leader in her own work, and while teaching others to develop, refocus, and grow, Marianne will bring the best guest and sometimes a special surprise. Don't miss this. You never know just what moment will change your life forever. Moments with Marianne airs every Friday and Saturday at 5 p.m. Pacific and 8 p.m. Eastern Time. Make sure to tune in and visit momentswithmarianne.com for more information.